Friends, in our last lecture, we had our first glimpse at the disciples of Christ in the Quran. In this lecture, we're going to focus in particular on that topic, on the disciples, and we're going to see that the way that the Quran presents the disciples of Christ is a reflection of the way that it presents, the way that it offers a perspective on Christians generally. Why don't we start with the term for disciples? In the Quran, the Arabic term is Hawariyun. And the interesting thing about this term is that according to Arabic, if you're reading this as an Arabic word, the word seems to mean white. It has something to do with whiteness. And this leads to most commentators speculating on why could it be or how could it be that the disciples are associated with the color white. And the most common opinion that they have is that the disciples were bleachers or whiteners of clothing. Very simple explanation for why they're called something that has to do with white. One scholar named Farah, who dies in the year 822, wrote about this. It is said in the commentaries that they were called Hawariyun because they were bleachers of cloth. According to another view, in this we find, for example, in the commentary of Tabari, someone we've encountered before, the great commentator who dies in the year 923, the answer is they were called Hawariyun because their clothing was white. This is an interesting case where reading the Quran according to the Arabic meaning of words leads to a certain misunderstanding. And we can see, in fact, that the Quran incorporates words from other languages and sometimes uses those according to their sense in the original language. Before we give the solution to why the disciples are called Hawariyun, this term in Arabic, there's one other idiosyncratic interpretation by the 20th century translator of the Quran, Muhammad Asad. He renders Hawariyun, or rather he explains it according to a particular theory, that the Quran associates the disciples of Christ with whiteness because those disciples were members of the Essene Brotherhood, this group that we know about from the early Second Temple period, when around the time of the rise of Christianity, that existed in Qumran, the famous archaeological site in Palestine. Muhammad Asad writes, the Essene Brotherhood, this religious group which existed in Palestine at the time of Jesus and to which possibly he himself belonged, the Essenes always wore white garments as the outward mark of their convictions. Now, in fact, the solution to all of this is that the Quran speaks of the Hawariyun with this particular term associated with whiteness because, in fact, in Ethiopic, the origin of this term, it's not associated with whiteness. In fact, in Ethiopic, the word Hawariyun, in Ethiopic Hawariya, literally means a walker, but more importantly, it's the word used in the Ethiopic Bible for disciples. So it's simply taking a word from another language, in this case the language of Ethiopia, Ethiopic. Incidentally, Ethiopic is another Semitic language. So we've, in the course of our class together, we've had a number of Semitic languages we've dealt with. You're getting extra information on Semitic languages. We've spoken about Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, and now Ethiopic. In fact, there are other terms that seem in the Quran to have come from Ethiopic, including Ma'idah. We've mentioned this before, it comes from Ma'ed, this Ethiopic term. And in that passage dealing with Ma'idah, or the table that comes from heaven, we also find the word Hawariyun. So we have two Ethiopic words in the same passage. Let's move on, though, to what the Quran actually says about these Hawariyun. What does the Quran actually say about the disciples of Christ? Well, in one passage, we see that the Quran seems to praise or commend the disciples of Christ and seems to elevate them to a place above the Jews. This is a fascinating passage. In Quran chapter 61, or Surah 61, Surah As-Saf, in verse 14, we see that the Quran seems to refer to something like a split between the original followers of Christ, or rather a split at the time of Christ between those who followed him and those who did not follow him. Here we read in this verse, O you who believe, be supporters of God, as Jesus, son of Mary, said to the disciples, the Hawariyun, who are my supporters towards God? The disciples said, we are God's supporters. So a group of the children of Israel believed, while another group disbelieved. This seems to be a reference to the split. Those who believed, that is, in Jesus, and those who didn't. Those who would become Christians, and those who would remain Jews. Finally, the verse concludes, we supported those who believed against their foe, so they became dominant. This passage is fascinating because in that last phrase there, it seems to suggest that God himself supported the Christians, those who followed Jesus, those who said, we are God's supporters, against those who rejected Jesus, apparently the Jews. There's no hint here of any error, any theological or other error of the disciples or of the Christians. The Quran here simply seems to say that the disciples are to be commended or praised for the way that they recognize that Jesus was a messenger of God, the way they declare that they would be his supporters. But things are not so clear when we look to other passages in the Quran about the disciples. Indeed, there are two passages where we find that the Quran seems to have an ambiguous appraisal of the disciples and their faithfulness to God's word. The first of these is the Ma'idah passage we know, and I think it's worth just resuming this a bit, or rather turning back to it and examining exactly what that passage, the Ma'idah or table from heaven passage, says about the disciples. Friends, remember this passage begins in chapter 5, verse 111, where God says, "And when I inspired the disciples, believe in me and my messenger, they said, we have believed, so bear witness that we have submitted." In this passage, they seem to be great, or rather in this verse. They declare that they believe in God, that they believe in Jesus, and they even say, bear witness that we have submitted. The actual Arabic word there, we have submitted, is muslimun, which means Muslims. A Muslim would read this passage as though the disciples were saying, bear witness that we are Muslims. But what happens in the very next verse seems to change things. In the very next verse, the disciples ask for a miracle. They speak to Jesus. They say, "O Jesus, son of Mary, is your Lord able to bring down for us a feast from heaven," or literally a table from heaven? This is Quran chapter 5, verse 112. The response of Jesus after this, where he says, "Fear God if you are believers," suggests that their request or their demand is impertinent or improper, presumptuous. How dare you ask for a sign from God? Immediately after you have declared your belief, suddenly you're asking for signs as though you need something to believe. In fact, they do say that this is the reason for the sign they're asking for. They say, we wish to eat from it, so that our hearts may be reassured, and so that we may know that you have told us the truth. That is, the request for a sign in this passage by the disciples seems to be a test of Jesus as a prophet. We see here that the disciples in the Quran seem to be playing the role of the scribes and the Pharisees in the gospel who come to Jesus and demand a sign, who test him. For example, in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, verses 11 and 12, we read, "The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, 'Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation.'" This gospel passage seems to provide the background which explains the way that the Quran is presenting the disciples as those who claim to believe, but nevertheless demand a sign, test Jesus. Their belief seems to be imperfect. We see something similar in a second passage which seems to present the disciples in an ambiguous manner. This is not in Quran 5, but in Quran 3. Here, once again, the disciples are made to proclaim that they profess their faith in God. This passage seems to be pretty close to Quran 61:14, where the disciples declare they'll be supporters to God. Here we read, when Jesus asks, "Who are my allies or supporters towards God?" the disciples respond, "We are God's allies. We have believed in God and bear witness that we submit." Once again, they say, bear witness that we submit. The Arabic word behind that is that we are Muslims. They continue, "O Lord, we have believed in what you have revealed, and we have followed the messenger. So count us among the witnesses." Here again, one has a sense that the disciples are a model of piety, much like with the beginning of the Ma'idah or table from heaven passage. But then the very next verse, things change once again. And we get a sense that the disciples were not actually faithful to Jesus. Here in Quran chapter 3, verse 54, we read, "They planned, and God planned, but God is the best of planners." Now in our translation, this planning word seems to suggest something maybe not too devious, but the Arabic word mekkaru means something closer to they had a plot, or they had a scheme, or they seek to trick someone. Now, it should be said that the traditional reading of this verse attributes the scheming or the plotting or the tricking or the planning not to the disciples, but it looks back a couple of verses and attributes it to the Jews. And according to most traditional Islamic commentaries or interpretations of this passage, that tricking or that planning consisted in the plot of the Jews or the Israelites against Christ. In the end of chapter 3, verse 54 then, where we read that God is the best of planners or schemers, that's generally interpreted as meaning or being a reference to the way that God, at the moment of the crucifixion, turned someone else into the likeness of Jesus, and the Jews, thinking they were crucifying Jesus, in fact crucified someone else who looked like Jesus because of this miraculous transformation he had gone through at the hand of God. But in fact, this passage makes it pretty clear that it's not the Jews or the Israelites who are being accused of plotting or planning or scheming, but rather it's the disciples themselves. Indeed, we have a similar dynamic as we find in Quran chapter 5. The disciples profess faith in Jesus, but then they put him to the test. Here in chapter 3, or Surah 3, they profess faith in Jesus, but then they're accused of coming up with a plan or a plot or trickery. It seems that this plan or plot or this trickery is a sort of an accusation that the disciples said they believed, but in their heart they didn't truly believe. They claimed to follow Jesus, but they didn't follow him faithfully. This seems to be a reflection of what the Quran says generally about Christians. Here we have a community which claims to follow Jesus, but in fact has not been faithful to his words. We remember here, friends, the perspective of the Quran, that Jesus was something of an anticipation of Muhammad, that he taught the things Muhammad would teach, that his revelation from God, his book from God, was like the book of Muhammad, the Quran, that he was not son of God, did not die, was not a redeemer, was simply a Muslim prophet who professed monotheism. Well, before we conclude this brief investigation or analysis of the disciples of the Quran, there's a couple more details about them that we might add. First, we should say that the Quran doesn't have any particular interest in the characters of the disciples. It doesn't mention Peter or John or James or any of the disciples by name, nor Paul, who of course comes later in the Acts of the Apostles. In fact, we've already mentioned the Quran never quotes the Bible explicitly. There's one passage from the Psalms which is a bit close. The Quran refers to a camel going through the eye of a needle in chapter 7, verse 40, which is of course a reflection of the famous maxim in the Gospels. But it never quotes from the New Testament explicitly. It also has very little interest in any character outside of the Gospels. So in the Acts of the Apostles, or all of the letters of Paul, or the other letters, the so-called Catholic epistles, or in the book of Revelation, the Quran shows no interest in those books. So we see a sort of uneven treatment of the New Testament, a focus on the Gospels, and a particular focus on Jesus. We might also note that the Quran is not interested in the development of the church in any way, even though it's a book that was proclaimed for the first time in the 7th century. Christianity was all around it in the Middle East generally. We don't see any reflection of Christian ritual, of Christian liturgy, of Christian saints, or any other of the aspects of Christian religion. Instead, the Quran, let's not forget, is interested in theology, in the way that Christians, from the Quran's perspective, belittle God by considering Jesus to be the Son of God. This is why it has a concern with the disciples. It means to present the disciples as a sort of summation of the Christians. They seem to be those who've proclaimed their faith in Jesus, but their faith is imperfect. Still, all of this leaves us with a question. Why does the Quran not discuss the Bible in greater detail? Why does it not refer to the Gospels by names or the other aspects of the New Testament? Is it that the Quran is uninterested in the Bible, or does it not know the Bible in detail? And this is a question we will address in the upcoming lecture.